In 1866, Queen Victoria was introduced to a man unlike anyone she'd met before. She was informed by her aides that for the first time ever, a Malay ruler was visiting Britain. His name was Abu Bakr, and he was coming for lunch at Buckingham Palace. And though the Queen had never heard of Johor, the territory he ruled, she was no stranger to hosting foreign dignitaries from the distant lands that brushed up against her ever-expanding empire. When Abu Bakr was formally introduced to the Queen, he was supposed to bow low and wait for permission to rise. But this did not happen. Instead, he strolled across the room, took the Queen of England by the hand, and planted his bristly, moustache-covered lips upon it. This kiss was an epic breach of royal etiquette, so scandalous that newspapers in London reported on it for days. Fortunately for Abu Bakr, rather than being offended by the kiss, Queen Victoria was actually rather charmed. Over the course of their meal together, the Queen was surprised to find that Abu Bakr was a shrewd and charming man, who, despite his bold entrance, displayed impeccable manners. He was a podgy man with a chubby face that opened into a sly and disarming grin when he laughed. And as he talked, Queen Victoria became fascinated by the territory he ruled. Johor, she learned, sits at the southernmost tip of Malaya, just across from the British port of Singapore, and was Britain's closest ally in the Malacca Strait. When lunch was over, Abu Bakr said his farewells and left Buckingham Palace as a man enchanted by British culture. He and Queen Victoria had become genuine friends who exchanged fond letters for the rest of their lives. Though the Queen of England did, however, always address these letters to Albert Baker instead of Abu Bakr, a nickname she deemed more suitable for such a fine gentleman. Upon returning to Johor, Abu Bakr immediately constructed a new palace with an audience hall closely modelled on the drawing rooms found in Windsor Castle. And from there, he threw lavish parties to celebrate the Queen's birthday each year. Every British person he knew in Singapore was invited: the wealthy businessmen, the distinguished civil servants, and even the grizzled old Navy captains. But the best account of one of these parties happens to come from a man who was never invited at all. Frank Athelstane Swetnam was a junior cadet in the Straits Settlement's civil service, the lowest rank in the entire administration. He was, in 1872, only 22 years old when he was asked to escort the British diplomats to Johor. His orders were to wait outside the palace until it was time to go home. But Frank Swetnam was a brash and impulsive young man who loved brushing shoulders with important people, and he possessed a skill that would soon make him invaluable in Malaya. He was one of the few Englishmen in Singapore who had learned how to speak Malay, and Swetnam used this skill to sweet-talk his way into the party. Inside the palace, crystal chandeliers hung illuminated above rows of grand tables, which were lined with Southeast Asia's most powerful men. Dressed in four-piece suits, they drank gin and brandy in a futile attempt to stay cool amid the sweltering heat. Then, when the last of the drinks had been served, Abu Bakr rose to deliver his speech. But, to the horror of the British officials, he delivered it not in English, but in Malay. Unable to understand a word, the British officials were relieved to see the young cadet emerge from the kitchen and confidently stroll up to translate. Frank Swetnam was a towering figure, 6'2" and built like a rugby player, and his presence on stage was thoroughly unwelcome. Abu Bakr resented having the young Englishman appear beside him, and refused to pause his speech for translation. He even increased his tempo, prompting the British officials to erupt into laughter and jeers. But they soon fell silent as Swetnam kept pace and continued to translate with astounding fluency and ease. As the speech drew to a close, Abu Bakr toasted Queen Victoria and announced the main event of the party, a tiger hunt. The audience were led out to the palace grounds, where a makeshift arena had been constructed. At one end stood a buffalo, which had spent its life hauling wooden carts through the streets of Johor, and at the other end stood a large metal cage, which contained the tiger. When the audience were settled into their seats, Abu Bakr signalled for the hunt to begin. With a flourish, the cage was flung open, and then nothing happened at all. The crowd waited with bated breath, but still nothing happened. The hairs on the buffalo's neck stood on end, but other than that, still nothing. The fearsome tiger refused to attack its prey. Growing restless, the crowd shouted at the beasts, and the noise startled the tiger. Darting from its cage, it ran laps around the arena, desperately clawing at the walls in search of an escape. In response, the buffalo hoofed its feet against the ground, lowered its head, and then charged across the arena with perfect accuracy. Its horns piercing the tiger's torso and locking into its ribcage. Again and again, the buffalo slammed its impaled victim against the walls of the arena. Here is Swetnam's account of the crowd's reaction.
We were all shocked as we had heard that tigers hunt buffaloes in the wild, but the buffalo only suffered a small scratch on its nose. I did not want to see any more, but certain spectators prodded the stricken beast with sticks and umbrellas. They hoped to entice the tiger back into action, but he was far past running again, or any other effort, and did not move.
With one last thrust of its powerful neck, the buffalo tossed the tiger into the air as easily as if it were a kitten, leaving Swetnam to reflect on the event's unexpected outcome.
As soon as the tiger had heard the crowd, it panicked and tried to escape back to its home in the jungle, far from the haunts of men. But the buffalo, being a tame beast, was not distracted at all. It paid no attention to the humans and knew all too well how to defend itself from its true adversary.
Years later, when Swetnam wrote his memoir, he recalled the tiger hunt as a pivotal moment in his life. It was here, at the party in Johor, that he realized a brave new world was opening up in Malaya. He interpreted it as a sign that the progress of civilization was upturning the laws of nature and creating a world where even the fiercest predators could be reduced to nothing but prey and sport. A spectacle to be prodded with sticks and umbrellas by the wealthy men who made their fortunes in Asia. It was only a matter of time before the young cadet's fascination turned further north, across the Malayan hinterlands and into the jungles of Selangor. He didn't know it yet, but Swetnam was set to become the first Englishman to visit Kuala Lumpur. My name is Jesse Onslow, and this is Amok in the Jungle, a podcast about the extraordinary lives and struggles of Kuala Lumpur's earliest pioneers. Over the course of 8 episodes, this first season explores the early history of Malaysia's capital city, when Kuala Lumpur was still little more than a tin mining camp. It's a story about power, greed, and the relentless urge to bring order to chaos. In the previous episode, Yap Ah Loy got revenge against his enemy Chong Chong, and the Sultan of Selangor encouraged his son-in-law, Tunku Kudan, to wage war against Raja Mahdi. After years of futile fighting, Raja Mahdi and the rebels retreated to Kota Melawati, only to be attacked by British forces in a battle that became known as the Ronaldo Incident. In this episode, Kuala Lumpur receives its first European visitors. This is episode 3, The Fall of Kuala Lumpur. In the weeks following the Ronaldo incident, one man made it his mission to restore peace to the Malacca Strait. James Wheeler Woodford Birch was a pale, waif-like man, tall and gangly, with a scraggly blonde mustache perched above his top lip. For most of his life, Birch worked in British Ceylon, the island we know today as Sri Lanka, where he served in the colonial civil service, planning and commissioning roads. An unexceptional man in an unexceptional career. At the age of 44, Birch received an unexpected promotion. He was invited to become Colonial Secretary of the British Strait Settlements. His days would still be spent behind a desk while he reviewed government purchase orders, transcribed public speeches, and filed paperwork for safekeeping. It was a dull clerical role, but it came with a significant pay increase, so he accepted the promotion in a heartbeat, only for his early tenure in Singapore to be overshadowed by 2 tragic events. The first was the sudden death of his wife, who succumbed to a fever just a few months after arriving in Singapore. This left Birch with 3 sons to care for, a task he felt completely unequipped for. In his grief, he sent his sons to a boarding school back in England and found himself bitter and alone at the fringes of the British Empire. The second event was the Ronaldo incident. When the newspapers reported on Selangor's pirates, Birch immediately became fixated. He read every story he could get his hands on and came to believe the pirates were his opportunity to make something of his ill-fated move to Singapore. He blamed himself for the death of his wife, believing she would never have gotten sick if they'd stayed in British Ceylon, and figured if he could restore peace to the Malacca Strait, it wouldn't bring her back, but it might redeem him somehow, or at least give some meaning and purpose to her death. From his new office in Singapore, Birch campaigned for aggressive interference with what he called the native states, the various Malay territories which lay close to the British Strait settlements. He urged the government to make a show of military force to deter the pirates, but he wasn't taken very seriously. The governor of Singapore insisted that the job of policing the pirates belonged to the Malay sultans. It was their duty to manage their own countries, and not the responsibility of the British government. Still, the governor listened patiently to Birch, and eventually agreed to write a stern letter to Sultan Abdul Samad in Selangor. Between courteous salutations and fond wishes, the letter warned that the British would hold the old Sultan personally accountable for any further acts of piracy. It danced around in a jovial tone, but the brutality of its threat was crystal clear. The two men agreed it was a fine letter. Their only problem was that they had no idea where to send it. At this time, the British knew Sultan Abdul Samad lived in a palace somewhere on the Langat River, but their knowledge of Selangor barely extended beyond the coastline. They knew of Klang, but had never heard of Banda Tamasha, and had no idea how to get there. Eager for glory and redemption, Birch volunteered to find the Sultan and to personally deliver the letter. He started his search by going to Kota Melawati, where the Ronaldo incident had taken place. And when his steamship arrived, he saw plenty of signs of the recent battle. Birch noted the charred walls of the fort, the splintered coconut trees, and the burnt-out buildings of the village. And then, quite to his surprise, Birch spotted people inside the old, ruined fort. At first, Birch was wary. He thought perhaps the pirates had returned and cautioned his men to be on guard. But when he approached the fort, Birch was greeted warmly by Malay guards who invited him inside. He was ushered into a half-collapsed audience hall where, to his surprise, he was offered a glass of brandy by a man who introduced himself as Tunku Kudin. Birch was face to face with Sultan Abdul Samad's son-in-law, but he knew almost nothing about Selangor, so it took quite a while before he fully understood who he was talking to. As a way of identifying himself, Tunku Kudin showed Birch the decree Sultan Abdul Samad had written at his wedding. This was the long, meandering declaration quoted in the last episode. Birch understood that it meant that Tunku Kudin was the Sultan's son-in-law, but other than that, he couldn't make heads or tails of it. It was at this moment that Tunku Kudin saw his opportunity. He generously translated his title of Wakil Mutlak as Viceroy, a term the British used in India, which, if applied to Selangor, made him out as the Sultan's commander-in-chief. It was an audacious exaggeration of his powers that essentially implied that he was the representative of the Sultan, rather than just a representative of the Sultan. Birch was naturally a little skeptical of the claim. He still half suspected Tunku Kudin was one of the pirates, and it was all a trick. The only way to know for sure, he decided, was to get Tunku Kudin to take him to Banda Tamasha. Once there, surely the Sultan of Selangor could settle the matter. Birch had never led a diplomatic mission before, but by this point in the 19th century, the British had a time-tested strategy for such occasions. They believed the most effective way to negotiate with foreign powers was by demonstrating overwhelming naval force. Foreign rulers could either accept the outrageous demands of the British, or be forced to face the most advanced military power in the world, the Royal Navy. This strategy became known as gunboat diplomacy, and it was ruthlessly effective. Upon arriving in Banda Tamasha, Birch anchored his steamship 600 yards from the Sultan's palace and fired 3 rounds from his cannons into the surrounding mangrove trees. As the dust cleared, a very scared and very confused Sultan Abdul Samad emerged from the cockfights at the bazaar. Birch later reported,
"The Sultan met us at the entry of the stockade, and, taking me by the hand, escorted me to his audience hall, where he had chairs arranged for us all.
Despite the aggressive entrance, Sultan Abdul Samad welcomed his visitors politely. He greeted his son-in-law kindly and asked about the war against Raja Mahdi. He then listened patiently as the tall, pale foreigner introduced himself and explained his mission to end piracy in the Malacca Strait. But the Sultan's patience ran out when Birch presented the letter from the governor of Singapore. He told Birch that piracy happens, it cannot be controlled, and nothing could be done about it after the fact anyway. He couldn't understand why the Englishman had come such a long way to harass him over the actions of Raja Mahdi and the rebels. Undeterred, Birch moved on to the matter of Tunku Kuden's status in Selangor. He asked if the written declaration was genuine, which the Sultan confirmed at once. But when Birch asked if it meant that Tunku Kuden was viceroy, the Sultan was unable or unwilling to give a straight answer. He rambled aimlessly and politely, making jokes as he tried to brush the question aside. But it didn't work. And then, frustrated by the indecision, Birch gave the Sultan until 5 p.m. the next day to make up his mind if Tunku Kuden was viceroy, and then stormed back to his steamship. First thing the next morning, long before the 5 p.m. deadline had arrived, Birch sent another letter to the Sultan, one which made his demands more explicit. He required the Sultan to banish the pirates, as well as the chiefs who'd supported them. Birch also demanded that Tunku Kuden be officially appointed as the viceroy of Selangor, and, just in case the letter wasn't firm enough, Birch told the messenger to relay a verbal warning.
Tell the old man if he dithers any longer, I'll burn his palace down and take whatever tin I can find as an indemnity.
With British cannons bearing down on his home, Sultan Abdul Samad agreed to exile the rebel chiefs. Raja Mahdi, Raja Mahmud, and Syed Mashur were no longer welcome in Selangor. And then, with great reluctance, the Sultan declared Tunku Kuden as the viceroy of Selangor, even though no official position by that name had ever existed in his country. Only then did Birch agree to leave Banda Tamasha, and the exhausted Sultan was left to return to his cockfights. Once back in Singapore, Birch wrote a boastful report on his mission, which suggested the British should offer full support to Tunku Kuden. The report, however, makes no mention of the Klang War, of Kuala Lumpur, or of the tensions between the Chinese secret societies. It's clear Birch was only aware of the pirates on the coast and was completely oblivious to the chaos brewing in the jungle. By backing Tunku Kuden, Birch had entered the British into a civil war he knew absolutely nothing about. Raja Mahdi and the rebels had been banished from Selangor, but Tunku Kuden knew it was not the end of the Klang War. Almost immediately after he returned to Klang, rumors started pouring in that Raja Mahdi was recruiting more soldiers, this time for an attack on Kuala Lumpur. The rebel chief didn't care that he had been exiled, and to make matters worse for Tunku Kuden, he discovered that most Malays now despised him for inviting the British to Banda Tamasha and strong-arming the Sultan into naming him as viceroy. With Raja Mahdi's army growing by the day, Tunku Kuden was left with little choice. His only option for reinforcements was to hire a ragtag army of foreign mercenaries. Here's how these new recruits were described by a Dutch newspaper.
Some 300 or so vagabonds were enlisted in the Strait settlements. They were the refuse and scum of further and hither India. Thieves, rogues and swindlers, murderers and idlers. The best of them were made into sergeants and corporals. Runaway sailors, cook's assistants and deserters from European armies were turned into officers, even though their military knowledge was very scanty, if they had any at all. This half-savage band of thieves were without discipline, drill, or even proper uniforms.
Most of these men were sepoys, Indian soldiers who had been trained by the British Empire before becoming soldiers of fortune. Leading them was a former Dutch military officer named Van Hagen, along with his second-in-command, an Italian man named Cavaliero. Tunku Kuden knew the mercenaries were truly terrible soldiers, but they were the best he could get as popular opinion had turned against him. One account left by a Malay labourer records the tense mood as war returned to Selangor.
It was a time when suddenly the winds of tranquility changed to turbulence in Selangor. I was recruited to fence up Klang with wooden logs, while similar work was done in Kuala Lumpur. The timber stockades and earthen fortifications were built with escape routes and state-of-the-art defenses. Everybody in the country was on standby, waiting for trouble.
These state-of-the-art defences were likely pit traps. In the same way European castles were often surrounded by moats, the Malays enclosed their forts with a ditch, which they filled with razor-sharp bamboo spikes. In Kuala Lumpur, there were 2 forts, one Chinese and one Malay. The Malay fort was called Bukit Nanas, meaning Pineapple Hill, because the ditch surrounding it was filled with pineapples. Though not typically as dangerous as bamboo spikes, these prickly fruits seem to have deterred most nighttime intruders. Recent archaeological digs confirm that Bukit Nanas is where Sultan Pawasa, the founder of Kuala Lumpur, based his operations during the Klang War. Yap Ah Loy's fort lay to the south and was simply known as the Chinese fort. It stood on the hill behind Petaling Street, the main thoroughfare which runs through Kuala Lumpur's Chinatown. And it was here that the foreign mercenaries camped after Tunku Kuden ordered them upriver to defend Kuala Lumpur. Here is a first-hand account of their arrival.
I saw 2 white men with about 50 sepoys land their boats by the market. The sepoys were black people with frizzy hair from Calcutta. They landed their boats and entered Yap Ah Loy's fort like bees returning to their nests.
The account goes on to describe the chaos that the European commanders, Van Hagen and Cavaliero, brought to the camp.
Later that day, the 2 Europeans came down from Yap Ah Loy's fort. While walking through the market, one of them suddenly stole a shopkeeper's chicken, and then they both ran off with it. Of course, the Malays gave chase with creeses and hatchets. But the 2 Europeans were quick and managed to escape. That was the beginning of the Battle of the 2 Forts.
Clutching their stolen chicken, Van Hagen and Cavaliero fled all the way back to Yap Ah Loy's fort and barricaded the gates. They then tried to scare away the angry mob by firing their cannons without ammunition. But the sound of the blank shots only enraged the mob further. Within 6 hours of arriving, Kuala Lumpur's first European visitors had turned the camp into a battleground. What happened next is poorly understood by historians, but we do know the fighting lasted several days. We also know that it was Sultan Pawasa who led the uprising against Yap Ah Loy and the mercenaries. It's likely that Sutan Puasa sympathized with the Malay merchant whose chicken had been stolen. It has also been suggested that he felt Yap Ah Loy and Tunku Kudun were using the mercenaries to seize control of the camp that he had founded. The only thing we know for sure is that the fighting divided Kuala Lumpur's Malay and Chinese communities. The Malays fought from Bukit Nanas, while the Chinese joined the mercenaries in Yap Ah Loy's fort. And, as the battle raged on, each faction resorted to desperate tactics to wrestle control of Kuala Lumpur. Here is an account from one of Yap Ah Loy's soldiers.
One night, our commander took 4 black sepoys and tried to sneak into Bukit Nanas. Their plan was to disable the fort's cannons by stuffing their mouths. But the people in the fort were on high alert and all 5 men were captured. The men were tortured at Bukit Nanas and they were even chillied for 2 days.
Being chillied was a common form of torture during the Klang War. While being interrogated, prisoners were tied down as chilies were rubbed into their eyes. If the prisoners failed to give satisfactory answers, their flesh was sliced open with knives and the chilies were rubbed into the open wounds. After the failed assault on Bukit Nanas, the screams of the chillied men rang out all across Kuala Lumpur. Paranoia was now at its height. Sutan Puasa wanted his captives to confess that Tunku Kudun and Yap Ah Loy were trying to take control of the camp. But no matter how much chili he applied, the prisoners' story remained the same. They were simple soldiers of fortune paid to deliver supplies to Yap Ah Loy and to defend the camp from Raja Mahdi. Sutan Puasa didn't believe them, but he was running out of time. With every hour, the mercenaries were advancing further through the defensive pineapple pit, enclosing the fort. Knowing he couldn't hold out any longer, Sutan Puasa executed his prisoners on the banks of the Klang River, dumped their bodies into the muddy water, and then retreated with his followers into the jungle. The battle of the 2 forts was over as suddenly as it had begun. Yap Ah Loy watched as the Malay community fled with Sutan Puasa, and was probably unsurprised when he later heard that they'd all pledged their support to his enemy, Raja Mahdi. The rebel army was growing stronger by the day, and now the only ones left to help Yap Ah Loy defend Kuala Lumpur were a bunch of ill-disciplined foreign mercenaries and their chicken-stealing European commanders. When the British first settled the island of Singapore, they recognized the need for 3 essential public works. A fort was needed to defend the new port from pirates. A court of law was required to try criminals, and a municipal building was needed so that administrators had somewhere to do their paperwork. But even before any of these public works were conceived, the British marked out a special plot of land on their charts. A large, flat expanse of grass, which still stands in the heart of Singapore. This is the Padang, and it was here the British came to play cricket. Cricket is perhaps the British Empire's most enduring export. Wherever British ships docked, the sport soon followed. It was always consciously promoted by colonial officials, as it captured the values that they believed the empire embodied. A gentleman's sport which tests the skill, fortitude, and often patience of those who play it, while instilling a sense of fair play and healthy competition. Cricket was also a potent reminder of home. It conjured nostalgia for the gentle civility of village greens in rural England. And this was particularly true for Frank Swetnam, the 22-year-old cadet we met at the beginning of this episode. After translating Abu Bakar's speech in Johor, Swetnam quickly gained a reputation as Singapore's most ambitious and talented recruit. Reports by his superiors singled him out for his rapid mastery of the Malay language and for his exceptional memory. He was said to be able to recount entire conversations, hours or even days after they'd taken place. But, despite his obvious talents, Swetnam also had his critics. One report complained the young cadet possessed an unwavering smugness, which everyone found thoroughly unnerving. Every evening, when the blazing tropical heat began to wane, Swetnam took to the padang to bowl, bat, and field into the twilight hours. It was here the young cadet rubbed shoulders with some of Singapore's most influential settlers, and in 1872, he met a man who would change his life forever. James Guthrie Davidson was one of Singapore's wealthiest men, a lawyer by trade, but also an entrepreneur who ran the Straits Settlements Chamber of Commerce, a powerful business network that lobbied for British trade interests in Singapore. He was a free-spirited Scottish man with a long, dark beard who was, to all of his friends, simply known as JG. At the time, JG Davidson was defending a man in court who'd been accused of kidnapping a Chinese girl. Davidson was certain the accusation was false and believed the girl had run away to an obscure mining camp deep in the jungles of Malaya, a place called Kuala Lumpur. After a spot of cricket, Davidson invited Swetnam to serve as his translator and join his mission to find the missing girl. Their first stop was Klang, where they met with the Viceroy of Selangor, Tunku Kudan, who was initially somewhat baffled by his British visitors. He warned them that Kuala Lumpur was a war zone and advised them against going upriver just to find a missing girl. But Davidson and Swetnam wouldn't be deterred, so the three men settled down into an evening of drinking. Over wine and sherry, Tunku Kudan gradually loosened up. He revealed to his guests that he feared losing the Klang War. His debts had spiraled out of control, and his creditors refused to loan him any more money, which meant he was facing defeat, not because of any military loss, but simply because he was broke. This prompted Davidson to hatch a plan. He proposed to Tunku Kudan that they register a company together in Singapore. Davidson could then list it on the London Stock Exchange so that foreign investors could easily buy shares in the company. This would provide a convenient way for British investors to gamble on Selangor's lucrative tin trade, while also providing Tunku Kudan with heaps of foreign money, which he could use to hire more mercenaries and win the war. This proposal was the foundation for a long and lasting friendship between Davidson and Tunku Kudan. The two men were dreaming of a bright future for Selangor, and the vision intoxicated them. Having initially been perplexed by his British visitors, Tunku Kudan now urged them to go to Kuala Lumpur and to meet Yap Ah Loy, so they could see how rich the mines were for themselves. First thing the next morning, Davidson and Swetnam set off into the jungle on a small wooden boat. With every bend of the Klang River, they were greeted with more and more signs of the recent fighting. First, they spotted smoke sweeping through the trees. Then they passed abandoned mines and burnt out huts along the riverbank. Then, on the third day of their journey, Swetnam and Davidson found themselves steering between corpses floating downstream. They'd finally arrived in Kuala Lumpur. Their first problem was locating Yap Ah Loy. The camp was much larger than they'd expected, and the only description Tunku Kuden had offered them was that the Kapitan China was a very short Chinese man. As they looked around, they realized the market was full of short Chinese men. But just when they thought they'd never find Yap Ah Loy, they heard a shout and saw a man presiding over a market stall that was littered with decapitated human heads. During this stage of the Klang War, Yap Ah Loy was engaged in a rather bold incentive program to aid his war efforts. He paid $50 silver for every enemy head delivered to him at his stall. If the head belonged to an enemy commander or someone he particularly disliked, the amount was doubled. It wasn't a perfect system, but business had been brisk, and he took great joy in explaining this to Swetnam and Davidson. Then he invited them to dinner. Knowing that white people are hopeless with chopsticks, Yap Ah Loy had a problem. European cutlery was not easy to obtain in the jungle, so he had to improvise. He gave his servants a bag full of silver coins and instructed them to melt the money down in a furnace so it could be reforged into knives and forks. Swetnam records that the cutlery was essentially unusable, as the silver bent under the slightest pressure. But, being polite, he made no complaint and spent the evening quietly wrestling his meal with the wonky cutlery. The search for the missing girl began first thing the next morning. Yap Ah Loy showed Davidson around the camp, while Swetnam was left to his own devices. He decided to take his own tour of Kuala Lumpur, and later wrote the following account.
The normal state of Kuala Lumpur is robbery, battle, and murder. The place consists of thatched hovels with earth flooring, most of which are unoccupied. While Davidson was out making his inquiries, I entered what I thought was an empty hut, but inside was not quite as empty as I had expected. On the red earth floor lay a dead Chinese man, propped up with his back against the wall, and a bullet hole in his chest.
Swetnam left the hut and caught up with Davidson, who reported there was no sign of the missing girl. But rather than head straight back home, he decided they should go and take a look at the nearby tin mines. When they arrived at Ampang, the oldest and largest of the mines, Davidson and Swetnam were stunned. They'd expected to find a single muddy pit, but had instead stumbled upon a vast network of trenches that sprawled as far as the eye could see. As they inspected the pits, Davidson pulled out his notebook and calculated how much tin was being extracted and how much it would sell for in Singapore, and quickly realized that Tunku Kuden was going to be a much more important friend than he'd anticipated. With nothing left to see, Davidson asked to be led back to Kuala Lumpur, so they could go back to Klang and then return to Singapore.
We walked in single file as there was only a narrow path through the jungle, and Yap Ah Loy had insisted on sending guards with us. I was behind a young warrior whose only clothes were a large palm leaf hat and the shortest of shorts. Over his shoulder the man carried a stick with a loaded 10-chamber revolver, dangling from a piece of string, and as we jumped across streams and walked for miles over roots, the weapon continually bumped on his back. With each bump, I was reminded of the solitary figure slumped over in the squalid mud hut that I'd entered back in Kuala Lumpur.
Davidson spent the journey home scheming about founding a company with Tunku Kuden and growing rich from Kuala Lumpur's mines. Swetnam, on the other hand, remained haunted by the signs of violence he'd witnessed. Never before had he seen anything like the chaos and violence that tin had unleashed in Selangor. While Davidson was dreaming of the riches he could make, Swetnam's mind was far away. He was dreaming of playing cricket on Singapore's Padang and of order and civilization. As soon as Swetnam and Davidson left Kuala Lumpur, Yap Ah Loy's attention returned to the war with Raja Mahdi. His army was heavily outnumbered by the rebels, so he had always fought a purely defensive war, splitting his army between protecting Kuala Lumpur and the surrounding tin mines. This worked well enough, but it left the foreign mercenaries, Van Hagen and Cavaliero, impatient for glory. Before long, they proposed a bold offensive to crush the morale of the rebellion, and, after much reluctance, Yap Ah Loy approved their plan. The target of the attack was Syed Mashur, whose army was camped near the Gihin stronghold of Kan Ching. Yap Ah Loy watched the mercenaries depart Kuala Lumpur as a force of 100 soldiers, and, a couple of weeks later, watched them return as a handful of broken men, starved, diseased, and shell-shocked. The foreign mercenaries had no idea how to fight in the jungle, and had been easily defeated by Syed Mashur's more experienced army. Everything unraveled quickly after the mercenaries' failed attack. The rebels swept forward, facing no resistance, as they encircled Kuala Lumpur and blockaded it from the outside world. Raja Mahmud, Syed Mashur, Sultan Pawasa, and even Raja Mahdi himself converged into a single army and prepared to land the final blow against Yap Ah Loy. Kuala Lumpur's crude defences were easily overcome by the rebels, but they faced fierce resistance as they approached the Chinese fort, where Yap Ah Loy and his men staged their final stand. It was the warrior Raja Mahmud who devised an unusual plan to overcome the fort's defences, as one of his soldiers later explained.
We spotted a tall fig tree on the eastern side, where the morning sun enters the fort. During the night, we snuck over to the tree and quietly lifted a platform up with ropes and a crane. When the platform was secure, 2 hand cannons, a pair of Malay drums, and a gong were also hoisted up. When the sun rose, many of our enemies were killed as we picked them off from above.
Unable to defend against the treetop assault, Yap Ah Loy gave the order to evacuate the women and children from the fort. This panicked the foreign mercenaries, who immediately recognized all hope was lost. Van Hagen and Cavaliero mustered their troops and followed the Chinese women and children into the jungle. From the ramparts of his fort, Yap Ah Loy would have been able to watch the smoke as the rebels set fire to his home. The flames engulfed the pagoda where he'd been installed as Capitan China and consumed Maidan Pasar, the camp's central market. Everything he'd built was burning before his eyes, and he was utterly powerless to stop it. Yap Ah Loy had assumed that he'd seen the last of the foreign mercenaries when they fled, but, to his surprise, Van Hagen and Cavaliero re-emerged from the jungle just a few hours later. They had been betrayed by their guide, who, rather than taking them back to Klang, led them straight to Syed Mashur's army. Too demoralized to resist, they surrendered on the spot and were then tied up and marched back to Kuala Lumpur. Yap Ah Loy watched from his fort as the 2 Europeans were bound back to back, and muskets were placed into their mouths. There were no final words, just muffled cries as the triggers were pulled. Afterwards, what remained of their heads was mounted on spears and paraded through Kuala Lumpur as war trophies. Then, the sound of gongs rang out across the camp, signaling the rebels' final assault on the Chinese fort. This was Yap Ah Loy's last chance to flee. As the rebels breached the walls, Yap Ah Loy led his troops through a secret tunnel beneath the fort. They made a desperate rush into the jungle and ran south along the river, cutting their way through any rebels who tried to stop them. Several times, Yap Ah Loy was almost captured. During one particularly close struggle, his clothes were ripped from his back. But Yap Ah Loy urged his men to keep going, knowing no one would be safe until they made it back to Klang. Here is how Yap Ah Loy's bodyguard described their desperate escape.
The Capitan had never before suffered such a severe defeat. Many of his close associates were either killed or wounded, and we had to restrain him to keep him calm. None of us rested until we got back to Klang. When Tunku Kudin found Yap Ah Loy among the survivors, wearing only a piece of underwear, he knew Kuala Lumpur had fallen.
Yap Ah Loy had lost everything: his home, his mines, and many of his closest friends. Seeing him in just a pair of underwear, Tunku Kudin assumed he was a defeated man and offered to give him a job on a tin mine far away from the fighting. But Yap Ah Loy refused the offer outright. Kuala Lumpur was his home. He'd built it, he'd fought for it, and there was no way he was going to abandon it to his enemies. My name is Jesse Onslow, and you've been listening to Amok in the Jungle. The voice actors in this episode were Lachlan Lucas, Paul Cooper, David Coyrol, JJ Yu, and Demian Rick. This episode was recorded by Kit Lee at Vine Music Studio, with music and post-production by Wendy Graham. You can follow me on Twitter at Jesse Onslow, or join the Reddit community over at Amok Podcast. This podcast is made available for free and without ads, which means I can only keep making it with your support. If you're able to make a donation, please consider subscribing to my paid newsletter at amokpodcast.com. By subscribing, you'll get access to maps, archive photos, and other extra content. I'll also post a list of the books and journals used to research each episode at amokpodcast.com. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please leave a nice review wherever you get your podcasts, and remember to subscribe for future updates. In the next episode, the British find a drastic solution to piracy in the Malacca Strait, while Yap Ah Loy seeks revenge against his enemies. Until then, terima kasih banyak dan jumpa lagi.